My name is Haven Hawley. I'm Chair of Special and Area Studies Collections Department at the University of Florida, and I'm an historian and sociologist of technology and science.
My name is Michael Whitmore. I'm the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, and prior to that I was a professor of English.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Fagan Davis. I'm the executive director of the Medieval Academy of America. I've spent the last 30 years cataloging, studying, writing about, blogging about medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in North American collections. I am a former BSA fellow a million years ago and also a PBSA author.
I'm Earl Havens. I'm a curator of early books and manuscripts at Johns Hopkins University, and I direct our recently endowed new Center for the History of the Book in the Renaissance.
Thank you, and we welcome Michael for our first speaker.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I am really honored and delighted to be here, and I did want to say at the outset my thanks to you, Aaron, and to Barbara. And just to say the feeling of kinship I feel our library and our organization it helps inspire the love of books and bibliography, and the work that you're doing, especially in cultivating the next generation of people who will love books as physical objects, is inspiring to me and absolutely essential. So I applaud the work that you do, and we're all grateful for it, really. Today, I will make comments about the use of technology, mostly in the Folger Shakespeare Library, and I'll make three kinds of comment. The first will be about technology and the history of the Folger, that is, how long have people been thinking in terms of technology. The second will be about digital media and what it does for collections, and then the third will be comments about biology. There is a new field called biocodicology, which is the study of how we can learn about books and their physicality with the help of techniques from genetics. So I'll try to cover those three in the 13 minutes that I will be speaking. So the Folger Shakespeare Library was designed in the late 20s and it opened in 1932. Mr. Folger did correspond with his Cray, his architect, the Beaux-Arts architect Paul Cray, and there were three technological innovations that Cray offered the Folgers that they thought a lot about. The first was the possibility of having a photostatic unit, a dedicated room in their new building. The second was something called 1928-29 air conditioning, which puzzled the client. And the third was an innovation of faux wood paneling that was actually made out of asbestos. So the Folgers accepted the first. They asked for air conditioning, but only for the books, and happily they declined the asbestos. But in the late 1940s, we started to see what I think we're beginning to talk about in terms of the digital humanities. The Hinman collator was a device created by Charlton Hinman to look at variants in the collection of first folios that were at the Folger. Mr. Folger was, I think, the beneficiary of Emily Folger's knowledge of the variants in the first folio and the history of the printing of that book. And both of them knew that by collecting these folios, someday someone would compare them to try to find out what the final state of the printed sheets should be, since they retained the sheets that were not corrected and then randomly combined them to create the books. And in the 1940s, Charlton Hinman systematically compared 55 different copies of the first folio using something called a Hinman collator, and this device uses flashing lights and independent eyepieces to compare leaves of folios so that the brain of the user will be confused by the differences and the variant readings will lift off the page. Very clever. Another project that I think is worth mentioning in the prehistory here is the work of Carolyn Spurgeon, whose papers are at the Folger. Carolyn Spurgeon was the first woman to be named a full professor of English in Britain. She was also one of the first people to do quantitative work in the comparison of the word choices of different writers. And I just wanted to show this graph from her landmark publication, Shakespeare's Imagery, because in it she compared the number of images that came from the fields of sea exploration, gardening, clothing, color, and the law, and began to try to understand how specific writers would use those images in different proportions. But this really does feel like one of the first visualizations of books, and it's important. Moving on, though, the second topic I wanted to discuss was how digital media has changed the way in which we access and use collections. I have here a screenshot from early modern manuscripts online. Elisa Tersegni talked about the receipt book collection at the Folger. This is a platform that allows us to take images of manuscript, to transcribe them, and to format them. That process, which can be done by a crowd or by a group of dedicated transcribers and formatters, then creates a corpus of manuscript text. That's significant for early modern studies because we have the EBO TCP corpus, which was created from page images of texts in scope of that project, but those really are not a comprehensive representation of the word use in that period. And I say that because if you think about Shakespeare, if you look online, descriptions of Shakespeare's vocabulary, you'll often hear the statistic 2,000. That is that Shakespeare invented 2,000 words. That is definitely wrong. I think the number will be somewhere closer to 500, but the problem was the OED lexicographers were only looking at print, and they focused on Shakespeare because they knew it well. The advantage of having a full corpus of transcribed manuscript text of any subfield is that it allows us then to antedate the uses of words that we see and try to understand the first time those words were used. The first chunk of the work that will, I think, disprove the claims to Shakespeare's unique use of words will come from print, from the EBO TCP corpus. But the next, and I think it's not just as important, it's more important, is that manuscript is going to provide us a new window into the ways in which people were using words, and it will give us access to vocabularies that simply weren't registered in the texts that made it into print. It's also important that digital media gives us a way into collections other than catalog records, which for us at the Folger would be the canonical description of an object. So an image of an object can give you access to that object, but it's also the case that the transcriptions of manuscripts that are in our collection have become a finding aid. So you can have pictures of your entire manuscript collection, you can put them online, but that doesn't mean that people will know to go look at those images. For that, you need a transcription. And the ability to then go search for words and go right to those pages makes the manuscript collection more visible, more important, and more accessible. There are some other benefits to transcribing, and while the goal of an institution like the Folger is not to get media coverage in the New Yorker, we did have an opportunity to do that when David Remnick wrote a piece in 2018 about the departure of then White House Communications Director Hope Hicks. I'll just read for you this. Hicks, however, is kidding herself if she thinks that her tenure will be judged only for harmless situational untruths. The white lie is a phrase that goes back to the 16th century at least. Shakespeare's World, a collaboration between the Oxford English Dictionary and the Folger Shakespeare Library, reports that in 1567, one Ralph Adderley wrote of his brother-in-law, "I do assure you he is unsuspected of any untruth or any other notable crime except a white lie." It does matter when people start to use words. It gives us a sense of what becomes nameable and what captures their attention. This particular phrase gives us a sense of the tolerability of lying and truth-telling, but we would love to go further and further back. Let me show you one other form of electronic access, and then we'll move to biology. So the advantage of having a complete list in sequence of the words that are in a text means you can then start asking how those words vary in different proportions. And I did want to show this screenshot of something called a discovery engine that was created by Anupam Basu, which essentially measures the degree to which any text you are interested in is related to other texts based on the shared vocabularies or the words that they exclude. And the most interesting thing about this tool, I think, is that because the EBO TCP corpus is encoded not just for the words that are used in their sequence, but also for format. That is, where are the paragraph breaks, what are the ways in which the page is constructed. It is possible to find similar books based solely on the distribution of tags or format tags in that corpus. What does that mean? It means that books that looks the same have often the same content. And it's a way in which the materiality of books and their disposition of text on the page is actually helping us understand how book formats then gravitate towards certain types of topics. If you are a word in the 16th and 17th centuries and someone is going to carry you around in their pocket in a duodecimo format, one interesting thing we can say now is that you are likely a word about religious faith or about agriculture or about the weather. It's not surprising, but it does give us a sense of what kinds of words and what populations are gravitating towards what kind of formats. Let's move now to biocodicology. We had a chance after the 2012 discovery of the body of Richard III in a car park in Leicester to meet Turi King, who's an archaeologist who made that designation. She did it by following mitochondrial DNA, which is passed on identically from mother to daughter, so that one could say from a sample from a descendant that this particular target, which is the sample from the body, actually is that person. So as we met with Turi, this is 3/5 of a team that made up a project called Project Dust Bunny. Project Dust Bunny was a project that involved taking a cotton swab and swabbing the dust in a 17th century copy of the New Testament, and then sending that dust to the NIH. The NIH sequenced that DNA, and they came back with us with a reading of the 2 individuals who must have dropped those samples into the book. This was surprising to us first because it tells us that books may be even better than bodies for collecting and storing DNA. You lean over a book, you deposit hair and skin cells, and then you put it on a cool shelf for hundreds of years. This is very efficient, and it's dated. That's also important. So what we realized after the sequencing of that material, and here's in our conservation lab the sequencing taking place, is that collections like ours contain evidence that is very important, but that is physical. And so the Folger collection, as we would like to treat it, is also a bioarchive. It contains important genetic information that we could reliably someday assign to donors. There are important ethical issues around that and confidentiality issues that libraries will need to grapple with. But the basic idea that the full description of a bibliographic object might also include its biological substrate and those deposited on it feels important for those of us who love books. And someday, the description of books may also include the genomic sequences that are associated with them. That is quite a verbose record and a far stretch from a single entry catalog entry. So I want to close by saying it is an exciting time in libraries. It's also somewhat disorienting because we know the price of sequencing DNA is going to go down. And really, probably the most important thing we can do now would be to not throw away evidence and to not destroy it. The responsible thing, I think, at this point is to think about how we can preserve material in our conservation practices so that later they could be consulted, but also to try to raise the awareness of the fact that books as objects are significant both because of the words they contain, but also because of what they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm a little bit tinier. I need to adjust the mic. Thank you so much to Barbara and to Aaron and to the BSA for inviting me to share my work with you today. I'm very pleased to be here. There is no medieval manuscript that has been seen, studied, analyzed, and debated more than the mysterious and as yet unread Voynich manuscript, more formally known as Yale University Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, Manuscript 408. The manuscript is so infamous that medievalists and bibliographers have been conditioned to roll their eyes when the very name is mentioned. It's easy to forget that underneath the media buzz and the unsubstantiated theories lies an actual 600-year-old object that is well worthy of serious study. As you can see behind me, the Voynich is written using an otherwise unknown collection of symbols with linguistically identifiable prefixes, suffixes, and bigraphs, as well as repeating orthographic and grammatical patterns. The appeal of the Voynich is amplified by its illustrations, which include unidentifiable but detailed and realistic plants, circular, zodiacal, and astronomical diagrams, crowned nude women bathing in green or blue pools. A friend of mine, in honor of Terry Jones, asked me to refer to them as watery tarts, and other illustrations that defy description. Is it gibberish? Is it an invented language? Or is it a natural human language, an encoded written language, or a phonemic transcription of a spoken language? No one knows yet. The illustrative contents suggest that it is some kind of a medical compendium, but until the text can be read, we will not know for sure. Dozens of solutions have been proposed in the last century alone, most of them more aspirational than they are substantive. The first formal published solution in the 1920s argued that the Voynich was written by Roger Bacon. Others have credited it to Leonardo da Vinci, or claimed that the plants are Mesoamerican. Some think it's a hoax, a forgery perpetrated by the early 20th century owner for whom it is named, dealer Wilfrid Voynich. Recent chemical analyses concluded that the oak gall ink and the mineral and botanical pigments are consistent with medieval recipes. And carbon-14 analysis has dated the parchment to between 1404 and 1438. That rules out Roger Bacon, who was already dead, and Da Vinci, who hadn't yet been born. Well, that's all well and good, but we still can't read the thing. What does it say? Where and when was it written? Linguists, botanists, medical historians, cryptologists, and even a few xenobiologists have all studied the manuscript with no clear-cut results. In the end, I suspect it will take a team of subject specialists working collaboratively to solve the mystery of the Voynich manuscript. What follows is my contribution: a close study of the handwriting and the glyph set, and a determination of how many scribes collaborated to create the manuscript. A paleographical analysis that I hope may bring us one step closer to solving the Voynich manuscript. In the 1970s, a Voynich investigator named Prescott Currier discovered that there are two different patterns of glyph frequency and combinations on different sets of leaves. He called these language A and language B, although I actually prefer the term dialect instead of language, and that's what I'll use today. Currier also, quite correctly, discerned two primary hands at work in the first the botanical section of the manuscript, scribe 1 and scribe 2, noting a direct correlation between dialect A and scribe 1 and dialect B and scribe 2. He attempted to identify the hands elsewhere in the manuscript, but his work is incomplete. Others have made paleographical observations over the years, including BSA President Barbara Shaler, who in her 1987 description for the Beinecke catalog notes that the manuscript appears indeed to have been written by several different hands. Some of these distinctions are quite clear. Here, for example, are consecutive leaves 31 verso and 32 recto, clearly written by two different hands, scribe 2 on the left and scribe 1 on the right. And you can see just from the naked eye that scribe 1 is broader, more widely spaced, and somewhat neater than, I would say legible, but perhaps that's the wrong word to use, than is scribe 2. The identification of the number of scribes and their individual corpora in the Voynich manuscript may have important implications for understanding the conditions under which the manuscript was created and for suggesting new directions for linguistic research. Since Shaler's observations in 1987, no trained paleographer or codicologist has revisited the relationship between scripts, dialects, and codicological structure in the Voynich manuscript until now. The Voynich presents an interesting paleographical problem from a theoretical as well as a practical perspective. Can we apply the methods and methodologies of Latin paleography to a unique glyph set such as that used in the Voynich manuscript? Specifically, can we use recently developed tools developed for digital paleography to facilitate this work? Well, I think you can guess what the answer is. The answer is yes, we can, using an application called ArcType. There we go. ArcType is a tool developed by the Digital Lab at King's College London to facilitate digital paleography. The application combines image annotation with a customizable data model and a powerful search engine, facilitating sophisticated discoverability that would be impossible using an analog methodology. One of the fundamental principles of the ArcType model is that each annotated character, in this case symbol or glyph, must be attached to a predefined character tag using machine-readable letters and symbols that can then be made discoverable. To set up my ArcType data model, I had to associate each of the glyphs with a machine-readable symbol or letter. Now, it is extremely important to remember that these substitutions are not intended to have semantic significance. They are arbitrary machine-readable substitutions used to facilitate computational analyses. The extensible Voynich alphabet is the ASCII character substitution most commonly used by Voynichologists. That is a word. But as a paleographer, I have a real problem with this substitution schema. EVA transcribes these two extremely common characters as I, and I, breaking them down into their constituent minims. To my eye, paleographically, these should be distinct characters, not composites. The much larger character set, known as V101, substitutes this letter with M and this one with N, which is a paleographically more consistent way to signify these Voynich characters. And so I decided to use V101 to assign machine-readable characters to each Voynich glyph in my ArcType data model. ArcType allows you to annotate images with discoverable facets such as scribe, character, or folio, and then search for those annotations on combinations of facets, pulling the resulting annotations out of their images and into a digital lightbox where you can study and manipulate them. For the Voynich, this methodology facilitates not only the distinctions between scribes, but also the identification of which hands wrote on which leaves, which bifolia, which quires, which sections, and how and if different scribes collaborated. It is important to note that this work is only possible because the Beinecke's high-resolution images are online, open access, freely downloadable JPEGs. So I uploaded images from the manuscript into my ArcType instance, which you're seeing run here. which I called Voynich Pal, set up my data model, and started annotating. Initially, I annotated many different characters, but after spending some time looking closely at different glyphs, I decided to focus initially on this character, this one, which in V101 is called H. So that's what I'm going to call it today. I'm not saying that that character is, in fact, an H. Just let's be really clear about that. So, the H. Once the annotations were complete, I used the faceted search to zero in on the annotated characters, pulled them out into this light box where they could be literally sorted, moved around, and grouped together. As in Latin or vernacular paleography, we need to consider the ductus, the way that a letter is formed, in each variant of the character, determining and distinguishing features that are unique to each hand. For the H, for example, we might ask, are there feet on the minims? Are the minims vertical, or are they at an angle? Is the glyph formed by one stroke or two strokes? Is the crossbar bowed, rounded, or is it horizontal? This is directly related to the previous question, since a bowed crossbar tends to result from a smooth directional change from the top of the minim, while a horizontal crossbar is the result of lifting the quill after completing the minim. And then finally, that loop. Is it big, small, round, or oval? Now, you don't want to get so lost in the trees that you lose sight of the forest, of course, and so the general character of each hand is important as well. This preliminary analysis identified 5 hands, the 2 labeled by Prescott Currier as Scribe 1 and Scribe 2, and 3 more that I have cleverly designated Scribes 3, 4, and 5. The H character written by Scribe 1, whoop, go back. Can I go backwards? Up. Whoop, hold on. No, one more. There we go. Okay, there it is. All right. The H character written by Scribe 1 is neat, careful, broad, and open. Scribe 2 is somewhat more cramped than Scribe 1, with a slightly slanted character. This scribe's H uses a horizontal straight crossbar indicating a lift of the pen after the completion of the first vertical, an oval loop, and an upwardly angled final tick. The H written by Scribe 3 is similar to that of Scribe 1, but a little bit more compact. The H written by Scribe 4 is a horizontal crossbar, an oversized loop, and a prominent final foot. And then finally, Scribe 5 writes a very tall, vertical, narrow glyph with a bowed cross stroke that angles out from the top of the vertical, a round loop, and a minuscule tick. After further analysis of the entire glyph set, 2 even more determinative choices for the present study were identified, the word and glyphs transcribed in V101 as N and M. The N glyph is formed by 2 diagonal minims leaning sharply to the left, while the M glyph is comprised of 3. Each stroke begins at the upper left, with the final minim of each glyph distinguished by a flourish that begins at the bottom of the final minim and extends up and back over the glyph. This finial varies significantly from one scribe to the next. In fact, the form and endpoint of the final flourish of M and N are sufficient to determine scribal identity in the Voynich manuscript. The initial analysis of M and N identified the same 5 scribes, as did the study of the H glyph. So let's do this again. Scribe 1 is distinguished by an M finial that begins at a 90-degree angle from the bottom of the final minim, looping high and back to end in the above the penultimate minim. For Scribe 2, the angle of origin is much tighter, closer to 45 degrees, and the flourish itself is low and short, ending above the final minim. Scribe 3 uses a tighter final flourish that nearly closes at the top of the final minim. And the finial written by Scribe 4 is brief and open, finishing above and to the right of the final minim. Scribe 5 ends the M glyph with a long, low finial that finishes above the penultimate minim. It was Currier who first determined that scribe 1 writes in dialect A and that scribe 2 writes in dialect B, at least in the botanical section of the manuscript. The other 3 scribes that I have identified, 3, 4, and 5, also use dialect B, according to the tests developed by Currier and refined by Voynich expert René Zandbergen. One test for dialect B is the frequent use of the word final 8-9 combination, a combination that is exceedingly common in dialect B, but much less so in dialect A. Another such pattern is confirmed by Zandbergen's refinement of Currier's tests. So here you can see the very strong difference between the combination 8-9 in dialect A, you hardly see it at all, and in dialect B it appears it's so common as to be almost kind of stunning and inexplicable to linguists. Zandbergen refined Currier's tests and recently demonstrated that the combination 4-0 is, quote, this is quoting Zandbergen, 4-0 is almost completely absent in the zodiac pages and the rosettes page, but appears everywhere else, unquote. And you can see this rather dramatically in this slide, where the 4-0 combination is highlighted in leaves from all 4 dialect B scribes. The combination appears quite frequently in the examples written by scribes 2, 3, and 5, but is quite rare in the work of scribe 4. The corpus of leaves defined by Zandbergen's phrase, zodiac pages and the rosettes page, unquote, corresponds exactly to the group of folios I've attributed to scribe 4. In other words, in addition to the shape of the M finial, the scarcity of the 4-0 combination is also sufficient to identify the work of scribe 4. Further linguistic analysis of these newly identified scribal corpora may reveal patterns that will distinguish them further. And I am currently collaborating with Professor Claire Bowen from Yale's Department of Linguistics to pursue this avenue of research. My initial results will be published in a few months in the journal Manuscript Studies, in which I will explore in detail the relationship between scribal corpora, textual sections, and choir structure in the Voynich manuscript. And I unfortunately don't have time to go into those details here today. The use of the archetype application with Yale's open access, high-resolution images enables a digital paleographic analysis of the Voynich manuscript and facilitates a much more detailed analysis of the glyph ductus variants than would be possible using an analog method. It is to be hoped that these conclusions will be useful to all Voynichologists, whether they're linguists, cryptologists, botanists, or medical historians. There are still many fundamental things we don't know about the Voynich manuscript, but there are some things we do know. The date of origin, the use of at least 2 dialects, the provenance, the codicological structure. Some things are facts. To these we can now add the number of scribes and an understanding of the collaborative nature of the manuscript's production. Any potential solution or reading of the manuscript must take all of these observations into account, combining them with a logical interpretation of the text and images, as well as an understanding of the material and historical evidence. Only by accounting for all of the evidence, paleographical, codicological, illustrative, historical, material, can we successfully unravel the mystery of the Voynich manuscript. Thank you.
I wanted to thank Barbara and Aaron for being so kind and generous in inviting me to participate in this extraordinary panel. It's really kind of funny. I mentioned to Barbara some time ago that it's a bit of a Beinecke reunion because basically Lisa and I were just like Beinecke bums. We just hung out in graduate school in the curator's offices all the time and just lived with books. And it was an absolutely wonderful time when Barbara was the director there. I'm going to talk about the work of a very large group of people. Just like the BSA, just like a lot of the things that were described here, a lot of digital work is done with teams, and we kind of do science. We kind of also don't know if it's going to work. which is really scary in the humanities, where one can always count on one's solitary labors to produce something. And so I'm describing to you a project that took 5 years, was generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and many other participating elements within the participating universities. I was the principal investigator, along with my co-principal investigator, Anthony Grafton at Princeton University. And the Princeton University Library staff were absolutely unbelievable and helpful in every way. And also a team at the University College London at the Center for Editing Lives and Letters, the late Lisa Jardine and her protege, Matthew Simons, and a team of programmers, catalogers, paleographers, research assistants, data analysts, and the list goes on. This is one of the challenging, and I think also one of the most rewarding aspects of working in this area. So, biblioarchaeology. We all probably have read or heard of Ann Blair's very famous book, Too Much to Know, this idea of information overload, of the transformation from the slow labors of the medieval scribe to the rapid proliferation of print, and the kind of dizzying quality of moving from that slow progress into a universe of staggering proportion of information that is almost impossible to navigate. I would put it to you that we encounter the very same thing in manuscripts of the Middle Ages, of the Renaissance, and really of all periods in history, because people scribbled information overload into the margins of their books, books within books within books. And that is a fascinating subject of study. Caveat lector. People with bad handwriting really punish those of us who wish to work on them in centuries to come. What is the history of what he is doing, albeit with a sword around his waist, at a moment in history? And where can we find the history of what this person is doing? Where is the history of this kind of systematic reading? Can we recover the idea of reading within a library? That is to say, not just how Renaissance people read Renaissance books, but how did they read libraries? How did they operationalize the contents of this incredibly powerful tool of a library in the service of man's estate? To answer this question, this incredibly talented team of people came together, beginning with Gabriel Harvey, the great obsessive, immaculate handwriting, thank God, the obsessive, somewhat pedantic Cambridge rhetorician, greatly ambitious of a diplomatic career that never happened. In fact, his students committed the worst crime possible. They satirized him in a Latin play at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and he was pedantius. There is even passages in which they're making fun of his scribbling in the margins of his books. But thank God that he did. So we chose from, and by the way, we chose about 36 16th century books from 12 libraries on 2 continents, with the incredible, helpful participation of so many different institutions, including people, some of whom are in the room. We worked from a wide array of material to try to represent the full sort of vision, as it were, of the experience of textuality as we could with really densely and richly annotated books. So we, of course, the first book we chose was a joke book. And that is from the Folger Shakespeare Library with vertiginous 360-degree marginalia. The most famous of Harvey's books, his Livy, with over 12,000 discrete annotations, his Castiglione, his the Wittenberg declamations of Philip Melanchthon, a host of other texts, including this rather pregnant note on the podagra, the great scourge of gout, in Olaus Magnus's great History of the Northern Peoples, a condensation of the civil law in Freagius's comments on the Pandects, Machiavelli's The Art of War, and all the time asking, what was that person doing when they were working with these books? And very often it wasn't like that. It was working with lots of different books on the table at the same time, in the same place, by the same person, over long periods of time. We needed a second reader so that we could actually begin to ask ourselves, what is not the archaeology of Gabriel Harvey, but the archaeology of reading? And so we decided to summon the great magus, alchemist, astrologer royal, John Dee, who entered the picture. He's sort of famous to many people because, of course, with his medium, Edward Kelly, he was able to talk to angels. So this was my first project where I actually got to talk to angels, and in addition to working with them, with his Aztec obsidian mirror and crystal ball and wax seals of God and scrying stone. We got really into magic, thaumaturgy, all this crazy, hermetic, wonderful stuff. It was a major education for many of us. And we chose from Dee books about mathematics, judicial astrology, his schoolboy Cicero, his edition of the history of Hernan Colon, the great incunabular collector, his history of his father, Christopher Columbus, John Dee's Euclid, of which there are actually several annotated copies. Very interesting to read because, of course, John Dee is so famous for his mathematical preface to Euclid in that beautiful book by John Day. His Geoffrey of Monmouth, full of the fake stories of the origins of England. The Vorka Dumia of Pantheus, if that doesn't sound exotic, I don't know what does. A spectacular alchemical book. What was Dee doing in his library? These books are scattered literally to the four corners. These were libraries of thousands of books, of which only, in the case of Harvey, less than 200 survive with annotations that are known. Dee, many more, but still not so many. The only way to bring this Humpty Dumpty story together again, in a way, is in the digital environment, where you can actually put a book at the Newberry Library next to a book at the Houghton, next to a book at the British Library, in the same space, at the same time, read by the same person over a long period of time, like our annotators. So I'm going to take a huge risk, break my cardinal rule, and try to do a little quick demo so you get a sense of how beautiful this thing has become, thanks to the work of our magician technologists. This is our corpus. If you go to our website, there's tons of information about the project there. I'm going to try to pull us up to a book that was hidden in a way in a private library, the magnificent library of Bob Peary, until it was purchased a few years ago by Princeton. It had hardly ever been worked on by scholars. Princeton bought it, they digitized it, our team completely transcribed all of the marginalia, encoded all of it into XML to make it machine readable, and put it up on the internet within a year, which is a pretty spectacular achievement. And this is the viewer. So if you open it up to a book, you get this gorgeous thing where you can see in incredible levels of detail the granular aspect of all of this. You can even do wheelies with this thing. You can do all sorts of things thanks to the Mirador viewer. You can reverse invert color. You can adjust contrast and image saturation, all this other stuff, which is really important for working with marginalia. What our innovation was for this project was to create an integral text panel to accompany these images within the IIIF environment. And so we have Latin inscriptions, which we've inscribed and translated and located with these little bits, little indicators. We have cross-references to people that are named, like here, the parabolic John Haywood. And if you go into this panel, we have an annotation panel, and integral to that is a toggled search panel, which I'll talk about in a moment. You go to someone like John Haywood, who is listed here. I click on John Haywood, and I can search within the book for other instances of John Haywood, and Miracle of Miracles on the last page is a further reference to John Haywood, a poet for common life, along with Tusser in his book, The Points of Good Husbandry. This allows us to navigate back and forth and across history. We can also open this up and search across all the books in the collection and find that in another book, Tusser appears. This is in that joke book from the Folger Shakespeare Library. You twist this thing around, blow it up, and you'll see there is a reference to Roger Ascham's Germanic Discourse along with Haywood's Proverbs. So you can go across the entire library to begin to pull these things together, across libraries where these physical things exist. You can, I can adjust the image, come here, and you can also see one last thing, the search. You can search, of course, in a composite way on this machine, and you can filter by all sorts of things. You can search the marginalia, you can search underlined text, you can search languages, people, places. There's a huge number of filters. But Harvey employed a symbolic system of annotation, such as the symbol of the sun as a sign of sacred kingship. So let's search for that. You can click there and on symbol, and then I can go down to the symbol of the sun here, and then I can hit search. And in this book, there are 217 separate annotations of sacred kingship within the book, and you can systematically examine all of them. Now, if you begin then to search across the entire corpus of books, you can actually find 354. So you can actually reconstruct an individual Renaissance reader's the disposition of all of their thinking about sacred kingship across all of these books in one place, which is a really remarkable thing. So, I'm going to just conclude with a few case examples, beginning with, and I'm going to cut one out if I don't have time. One of the most wonderful things about like working with the digital humanities is that reading in the Renaissance was a team sport. Gabriel Harvey records, for example, in his Livy, that he famously read with the poet Philip Sidney this copy of Livy and scribbled all of these notes into the book. It's an extraordinary thing because Philip Sidney went to Prague to Rudolf II's palace, and maybe he looked at the Voynich manuscript there, who knows. Elsewhere, he describes his mentor, Thomas Smith, Sir Thomas Smith. Mr. Thomas Smith and I, reading this decade of Livy together, found very good use of Cope's English History, a book that we don't have, unfortunately. But we can go into the archaeology of reading and search for Smith and find what Gabriel Harvey thought not only about what he read with Smith, but also what he did when he read Smith's own works. So we can find here a reference, a cross-reference, a bibliographical cross-reference in our digitized copy of Thomas Smith's treatise on the right use of the English language, the history of the English language. We can also find another recommendation in yet another book for what kinds of books should be read in public, in this case, Aristotle's Politics, according to Smith, and what should be read privately, Homer's Odyssey. I have no idea why. Nonetheless, that's pretty cool. You can actually then go to other books in the collection and find further references, including this wonderful image that we get of Thomas Smith and Sir Humphrey Gilbert taking on the persona of the Roman general Marcellus and debating his virtues with Sir Thomas Smith, and Dr. Walter Haddon. At Hill House, one of the first classical structures in England, with beautiful frescoes of ancient Roman history. And they're describing who bested who in this debate, reading this book together. And then by using the archaeology of reading, you can actually find what Harvey thought about their writing as well as what they read together. Also, marginalia is not always a commentary. Here is a large page of Livy's history of the ancient world, the ancient Roman world. Harvey annotates it, not the text. He's simply using all the white space in this useful appendix on weights and measures in the Roman Empire to create a long list of Roman emperors. And at the very end, he has this wonderful quote. These then are the most select... Oh, I'm running out of time. These, then, are the most select of already famous men from the superior history of the Roman Republic, in particular the bravest and wisest of them all. Hardly any other memory list deserves a deeper imprint. So great is the importance of those brilliant names in them, is strikingly represented in the art of remembering all Roman history. This is so redolent, this inscription, with the language of printing, of imprint and memory and striking representation. We have to think differently, I think, than manuscript versus print when we think about how people interacted with their books. But then I can extract a name in this long list of emperors and consuls such as Sulla, and then discover citations of Sulla throughout this text. So he's not just a member of a list, He's not a decontextualized member of a list, but he's actually a personality who comes out throughout the marginalia in the book and across other books in the corpus. I'm going to skip that. Yikes, because I don't have time. I just want to end now by saying that marginalia is not just reading history, is what we've learned in this project. Marginalia is another form of bibliographical practice. It is also a history of reading and a special kind of history of writing. Here, for example, is in this joke book, there's one reference to magic. Gabriel Harvey goes into this huge exposition on all of the most important books on the subject of thaumaturgy, and in what order you should read them, and which ones are indispensable, and which ones you can skip. So, in other words, it's not a commentary on what the text says. It's a memorial bibliographical activity for somebody who is reading this book in a library. And that is a very interesting thing. So I would say it's very important to think of marginalia as a kind of mechanism through which we can see how people operationalized libraries as information machines. It's interesting how when we move into the digital environment, we can begin to think about the technology of the book and the technology of the library, and I think dynamic ways that can be very exciting for scholarship. Thank you very much.
I want to know where to get a sword. Those were really fantastic presentations, and I want to thank Michael and Lisa and Earl for just these giving fascinating reports on their work. These three papers apply digital technologies to bibliographical questions that help us to traverse both traditional and new ground. I'd like to frame my comments by saying first that digital and analog are not opposites. We often talk about them as if they're opposed, but they're not, they're different. The founder of the field of history of technology, Melvin Kranzberg, was known for writing several laws about technology, and his first law was technology is neither good nor evil, nor is it neutral. And I think we should keep that in mind, perhaps. As a framework for looking at digital and analog in bibliography, let's think of digital as binary and able to be pieced apart and reassembled. Analog would be continuous with varying amplitude or tonality. So for instance, in printing, analog would be an image with tonality, and you could digitalize it by having a halftone photograph. That's a good example of that. The key difference, though, between these two approaches is that digital relies upon a sampling to construct a sense of the whole, rather than claiming itself to be an analog of the whole. From a philosophical perspective, neither of these approaches says that it is the real world. They are ways of apprehending and representing aspects of that real world, and that too is something to keep in mind. We dwell so much on discussions about electrical and coding when we talk about the technical approaches of today that we don't really stop to consider the ways that we as scholars also home in on discrete questions. We assign categories and reassemble the orders of things. From the fragments that we each focus on, we also are seeking the whole. Most scholarly approaches have more in common with digital perspectives than we care to admit. Michael Whitmore points to the long practice of applying technical approaches to bibliographical questions at the Folger Library. Rather than looking at Hinman's collator or debating the use of asbestos, and certainly that might fit into Kranzberg's formulation, I'd like to consider Carolyn Spurgeon, the human computer. Spurgeon was a computer in its original meaning, a person who computes. She categorized and counted instances of imagery in texts, undertaking analog computation. She extracted from Renaissance materials information that she then modeled into charts taking a flow of information and creating categorized data. Computers, too, can be analog. For instance, a thermometer, which specifies degrees. For our convenience, it's actually measuring a continuum of values. Slide rulers and the abacus are also examples of analog computers. The Folger has expanded on that computational history through its searchable transcriptions of analog works. Whitmore's careful distinction between originals and transcriptions that can be searched drives home the point that digital copies are not the same thing as analog. Digital data from these works are identified and constructed for different purposes than replacing the original. They provide an aspect of the whole, reconfigured. The words can be searched with or without a relationship to their original sequencing. They are not part of a composed text which has been specifically ordered in a sequence for a particular meaning or a set of meanings. Whitmore also shows us how textual objects contain information about the world of a text's origins and materiality. That information is beyond the text itself. Sometimes it is integral to the materiality of the text, he writes. The collection of DNA from a work is particularly profound. Beyond the mapping of genetic sequences which have created information about biological life, beyond the application of digital processes, the comparison of known data to the work at hand, beyond these is the very digital process of constructing from a sample a swath of a larger picture, if not the larger picture itself. Digital does not parallel analog. Digital samples. It creates enough of an outline and depth in that outline to help us see similarities. These similarities and differences are neither good nor bad nor neutral. They're what we make of them. They help us to perceive a wholeness from the facets that we are studying. Lisa Fagan Davis works to penetrate the mystery of the Voynich manuscript, and good luck with that. In this work, we see evidence of a community of ideas and practices. Or is it simply an internally consistent fabrication? Close examination, I would say, suggests the former. Taking the paleographical portion as her challenge, she expands the work of others to discern scribal contributions and to tease out evidence of a larger community behind the production of the manuscript, the originators of a language and conventions of meaning. We think. She's become part of that community herself. At the heart of applying digital technologies to bibliography is the anchoring of knowledge about a thing to that thing. Annotations externalize what a scholar knows, making that information accessible to others. Much of the knowledge process is opaque, however. A scholar's ability to recognize differences, like a craftsperson's ability to measure simply by touch, by smell. These are built on practical experience passed down through shared practices. The open access, online, and very available high-resolution images of this manuscript makes it possible to parcel out the task of examining this work to an entire team of specialists. Coding the particularities of glyphs so that differences and similarities can be made apparent is the foundation of the project. Her paper suggests that the two dialects may represent two sets of practices. Dialect B, we should even think, might represent a community of practitioners rather than a single scribe. In this model, the act of identifying, classifying, and assigning identifiers to the types of glyphs and their characteristics externalizes and codes specialist knowledge. The presence or absence of a mark or the categorization of a particular way of making that mark can be constructed as a binary.
even with an analog work at hand. This makes it possible to distribute, to reorder, and to create representative samples going toward the whole. And this is the heart of a digital approach. The Archaeology of Reading project looks at the construction of knowledge with the red text a foundation but not the end. Harvey and Dees build conversations with the texts they annotate and with other texts that are not at hand. What is in the margins is not marginal, Havens tells us. It can be the sinews for connecting a community of ideas, creating a library. Each of his annotators creates a body of work by marginal notation, even if the parts of that body are dispersed. This process of decoding and assembling margin commentaries may never be complete, though. The underlying process of reconstituting conversations is digital. Certain names are small parts that can be put together to help us recreate at least an aspect of the whole. These are crucial to reconstructing the larger library of which he speaks. In Havens' presentation, we see knowledge, community in action, not simply a reader's response, but something much larger. And so, from Michael Whitmore, we learn about the world and what is integral to the text. We learn about the world that produced the text. From Lisa Fagan Davis, we learn about a community of practice and its conventions. And from Earl Havens, we learn how annotators can become knowledge creators. I look forward to our discussion. To start, I would like to pose a question to Michael Whitmore. After his response, I will recognize people who have questions from the audience. Please do focus on questions rather than commentary. Dr. Whitmore, I wanted to ask you, given that the Folger right now is in transition, shall we say, I'd like to ask you about architecture and the scholarly experience and what the history of the Folger, both in terms of its building and in its digital projects and other aspects of it, can teach us about the scholarly experience of the past and also of perhaps the next era.
Thank you very much for, first, your very elegant response to the 3 papers. It was really wonderful. I think your question about architecture makes me think about what makes architecture unique, and one of the things that makes it unique is that you have to live with it. You have to live within it. And the affordances and style that, say, governs the design of our building are very deliberate. It's meant to elevate. It's also meant to isolate, at least in, say, our reading room. But there are other spaces that are meant to do other things, to open up, to invite. And, you know, the future, I think, certainly of the Folger, but of more abstractly, the information architecture that will either welcome or discourage people has to be designed. And, you know, there's been 5 to 7 years of really deep thinking about how to design the experience of being in this research environment, or if you're a member of the public, how you would be invited into these spaces. And, you know, my comment on that would just be that it really needs to be deliberate and it needs to be inclusive. We have collections that speak to experiences that have been exhausted by study, and there are voices in our collection, often in manuscripts, from people who've never been heard from. And the information architecture that we create will either make visible and audible those voices, or it will hide them. And so, you know, one of the things I worry about is creating a silent institution where we don't hear things. Sometimes I think maybe we need a curator of silence who decides how noisy it'll be in this room or that room. But it's important to understand that some of how we come to know people and places is through dialogue, and there are other moments when we really need to listen very hard, and architecture of both kinds will deeply affect that.
Will you be passing around a microphone?
I will be passing around the microphone.
Great. And I'd like to open it up to questions now. Yes, certainly.
I just wanted to say that while I was sitting here listening to Ray, Earl, you're Ray. Earl, I pulled up the Archaeology of Reading website, and I used it to demonstrate conclusively that, contrary to what some have argued, John Dee did not write the folio numbers or the signatures on the Voynich manuscript. Thank you.
So who would like to ask a question? I think, Haven, I'll ask you to select the speaker, and I'll
Certainly.
pass the mic around.
Yes, would you please say your name?
So, springboarding off of Earl's presentation, and as you brought up, basically the idea of annotations as a generative piece of scholarship and of their own, on their own. Each of you has created an interpretation or a piece of scholarship, an engine for analyzing this data. What role has thought for the preservation of the engines that you've created played in the creation of those engines? So looking at the annotations, how will people 500 years from now look at these engines? Will the TEI encoded data still be valid, and how will that transform? If you could speak to that.
Who's the question for?
Who is the
I think it's
question
for everybody.
For everybody.
Preservation.
I'll just, can you hear me? Yeah. I'll just start by saying that that's a very good question. So as we know from the first sort of generations of these digital efforts, many of them working without standards that were shared across stakeholders who were developing digital content and digital platforms. A lot of those things have disappeared or otherwise have become dysfunctional beyond what they were intended to do. So one of the wonderful things that we have is the so-called IIIF standard, the International Image Interoperability Framework, which creates the capacity for interoperability across platforms. So when a new, a better technology emerges, and we hope that they always will, although I'll tell you, Mirador 2, I guess it is now, is pretty good, we can migrate our content and our images from one platform to another. We also incorporate the archaeology reading into our permanent preservation plan within the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins University with our Digital Research and Curation Center. So that's a fundamental institutional commitment, which also supported collaboratively. So by having multiple stakeholders, in our case, the Princeton University Library, Center for Editing Lives and Letters at University College London, that expands, in a sense, our capacity to preserve ourselves and our work and the rest. But it's a good question because we don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have John Dee's crystal ball, so I can't tell you what it's going to look like 5 years from now, let alone 500 years from now. And I think we always have to keep that in mind when we think about producing and investing in these digital projects.
So one of the real advantages of using the IIIF framework, and it is becoming more and more popular and is being picked up by more and more institutions, is that it is designed to be digitally sustainable in a way that other systems aren't. And in keeping with what we understand and what we think of as digital best practices, the code that underlies a IIIF image, the JSON, is such that you can actually fairly easily separate the data from the image, and that then allows you to save that, to download, to save, to store the data, the underlying data separately and that does help with the long-term sustainability of the programming.
Well, you asked a deep question, and I think there's a near-term and a long-term answer. The near to medium-ish term, which would be, say, 15 to 50 years, is that collaboration, mutual shared standards, and sharing of formats that are developed by institutions that will stick around for a while seem to be the best bet. But really what's happening in the long term is that objects are over here and scholarship and knowledge creation is over here, often printed in the form of journal articles and publishing. Now it's electronic. And the tools and the storage media will probably die. I can't see formats surviving beyond that. I also think that data itself will rot. It's impossible to preserve even the operating systems that these tools will work on. It violates copyright even to simulate those operating systems today. So we just have to face that, and we got to save the objects. We can take pictures of them again in 50 years. The part that's harder is I think we've got to save the scholarship, and I think it has to be printed. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but there must be a physical reference copy with backup. And there can be digital surrogates around that too, but that would be the biggest mistake. We know the parts in the middle are going to disappear, but we need to make sure both ends are around for a long time.
Thank you.
Hi, Claudia Funke from the Huntington Library. Michael, the Dust Bunny project.
Yes.
So when you talk about we have to save the actual things, what about saving the dirt? And what about the implications of the kind of conservation that has happened? I mean, now we're certainly less aggressive than we were 30 years ago. I recall going to a Grolier Club exhibition. I think it was Grolier Club collects members, and there was a Piranesi print-up, a proof that belonged to, I think, Richard Wendorf, and it was very dirty. And there was a whole explanation, and kind of you got the idea, basically, by the time you got to the end of it, that this was probably Piranesi's dirt. And he kind of said at the end of it, my wife, who's a paper conservator, agrees it should not be conserved. And so we privileged Piranesi, he privileged Piranesi's dirt. At that point, 30 or 40 years before that, somebody wouldn't have recognized that implication. And what about all the people we don't know about or think about? So it's just a question for you.
Well, I didn't have time to talk about a second project, which we have very descriptive names for these projects. This one we call Project Nunspit. But there are sacred texts that are kissed in certain objects, osculatory texts, where we know that through non-invasive means we can harvest with films the saliva that is residual there. There's obviously many individuals. There's also residuals from use all the way up to the present. And you can sequence the mouth biome and the gut biome of the person who kissed it, which will tell you whether they were lactose intolerant. It can tell you, which is a proxy for north-south, at least in European populations. Anyways, so there's a lot of information there. And it's very clear that conservation practices have destroyed a lot of information, including cleaning texts. There's another extreme, which would be to try to save absolutely everything and never touch it. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think that the history of the object includes every event that happens to the object right up to the present, and that they're all significant. You know, you worry about digging underground and going past Troy and throwing it away. That's important. You don't want to do that. But I also think it would be wrong for us to take all of this information and say it's now our job to stop history and to never touch these items again. We should be respectful and reasonably cautious about preserving what we can. But it's always a choice. You know, which period do you want to preserve? Which readers are important or unimportant? And there's no set of rules that you can use to predict that. It is the question for an institution and its mission and the audiences and knowledge it preserves. And those non-obvious answers just have to be debated by those of us in the respective communities. So conservation, scholarship, but also how we put them out online and share that information.
And perhaps one more question?
Barbara Heritage. These papers have been so fantastic. Thank you each for presenting them. I was having a conversation earlier today about greater concerns at ACLS and thoughts about books and the sufficiency of having one copy. And bibliographers are often seen as being these other people, these idiosyncratic users. There are other terms that are used for bibliographers and book historians. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about your strategies for conveying the need to preserve multiple copies and to create these tools in the face of skepticism about space, about expense of maintaining libraries, and also about specialization, attention to detail, things like that. I'd be glad to hear what your broader pitch is to humanists who might not buy in to bibliography yet.
Okay, so, you know, this has nothing to do with really my work on the Voynich manuscript, but just my life work, which is 30 years of cataloging medieval manuscripts. So I am a very big believer in bibliography and description as a way to provide access, as a way to promote research, as a way of making these really rare objects accessible and discoverable. And the digital piece can only supplement that. It can only add to that. If you have made something, if you have digitized something and you've put it online in a way that is both discoverable with some really well-crafted metadata, which of course we're all really good at, because that's the way our brains work, and also in a way that is interoperable in this new model of being able to take images from one place and compare them to images somewhere else. That's good for everyone, right? That's good for researchers in that it provides access and it provides a way for people from all over the world to get at these objects. But it's also good for the objects because it cuts down on wear and tear, right? And we all want to conserve them, but we don't necessarily need to wrap them in bubble wrap and put them in a safe, right? But it does allow for researchers to determine whether they need to see an object in person by looking at the digital piece first. So, saves money, saves the planet by you not necessarily having to get on an airplane and travel somewhere. So I think there's no question that solid bibliography combined with digitization, those two things are good for everyone. They're good for all of us.
I just would add to that. I think that one of the other important points about really great digital projects is that they really do send people back into the library and into the analog and back through the digital and all around. I didn't have time to talk about, I was looking, one of my great privileges in my life was spending a week at the Houghton Library. Bill was there in the room. Probably witnessed my great enthusiasm for looking at Florio's First Fruits of the Italian Language, which was filled with marginalia by Harvey, which we did not digitize. We could not do everything. And it was there with the Archaeology of Reading at my desk that I was able to find where certain notes came from in other books. And then I went to EBO TCP, to Gabriel Harvey's printed books, and found further references that were quite different in different contexts. There is something incredibly expansive about this that should be exciting way beyond book history and bibliography, about generating new knowledge and new understanding by the power of making initial connections that can't be made. but that can become permanent ways of thinking differently about the historical past. And that can only be achieved in the digital environment. So we're very lucky, I think, to be alive now, rather than 50 years ago, with these interests in mind.
And on that note, I would like to conclude the panel, invite you all to adjourn for drinks, and to thank you all for being here today. And may we thank our panelists for their wonderful presentation.